this year.
The rise in anti-Asian racism in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic has sparked concern within the intelligence community, with some warning it could hamper efforts to counter foreign interference in Australia. Liberal Senator James Paterson is the chairman of Parliament's powerful Security and Intelligence Committee, and he's warning politicians need to be careful not to stoke anti-Asian or anti-Chinese sentiment. I spoke to him earlier. Senator James Paterson, thanks very much for your time. You've made some very interesting remarks in terms of the China debate, particularly as it pertains to the Australian-Chinese community. Can you elaborate for us on why you want those in this discussion to be aware of the impact on the local community?
Yeah, Kieran, this has been a long-held concern of mine, and we've got a twin problem. On the one hand, sometimes the Chinese Communist Party uses the tactic of saying all criticism of its behaviour is racist as an attempt to shut down debate, and we can't allow that to dictate the terms of our public debate. On the other hand, sometimes people do stray beyond the realm of appropriate public commentary, and there has been instances of racism against Chinese Australians, and that's totally counterproductive, as well as being morally abhorrent, that there are Chinese Australians who feel less equal, less able to participate in public life, they feel ostracised, and we want them to feel safe and secure in Australia. We want them to feel like they're equal participants in Australian society, and we want them to have the confidence to come forward to assist us in countering these threats. And
so does that go to the point about, you know, also having respect for their own Australian nationality? Because they are Australians.
Exactly.
The people that we're talking about, they have Chinese heritage, but they're Australians first and foremost.
The Chinese diaspora, broadly defined in Australia, is a very diverse and complex society in that people have come, some of them have come direct from mainland China, but others have Chinese ethnicity but have come from Malaysia or Taiwan or Hong Kong, and they've come at different points in their own history, and so each of them have a different perspective based on that. If you came to Australia from mainland China shortly after 1989, you probably have a particular view about democracy in China, and equally more recent participants, immigrants, are very proud of China's rise on the global stage, as they should be and as they're entitled to be. We need to protect the diversity of voices within that community so that no matter what their perspective, they feel free to participate. And they are from both sides, whether it's surveillance on WeChat or incursions into Australian Chinese language media, or racism on the other hand. Both of them feel curtailed at times from expressing their opinions freely, and it's our responsibility as parliamentarians to make it clear that they have full rights as any other Australian does to do so.
Do you think the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated some of the reaction here? Because there have been instances, thankfully not as much as we've seen in the United States, but instances of anti-Asian sentiment.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that is true. And early on in the pandemic, February last year, I went with Gladys Liu to a Chinese restaurant in her electorate in Box Hill because there was an irrational fear at that early stage of the crisis that you were more likely to pick it up from a Chinese person, or that they were going to be vectors for the disease in some other way. And it was really important for us to demonstrate our support for the Chinese small business community who were suffering really badly at that time, and demonstrate that they deserved equal respect as every other Australian does. Unfortunately, COVID has driven people's fears and anxieties about these issues.
Do parliamentarians have to be careful as well? And in this context, I'm thinking of Senator Abetz, where he called on a couple of Australians of Chinese heritage to reject the Communist Party. Do you have to be careful about that sort of instance as well?
Yeah, of course we have to be careful, and I'm always very mindful in my language to draw meaningful distinctions between the Chinese Communist Party on the one hand and the Chinese people on the other, who have no say in the Chinese Communist Party's leadership or ruling over them.
And often some of their fiercest critics, to be honest.
Exactly. I mean, my initial entry into these debates was a motivation to protect the Chinese diaspora, because I was concerned that a proposed extradition treaty between Australia and China would be a tool of repression against the Chinese diaspora in Australia, and I threatened across the floor to stop that from happening, and it was stopped. So we all need to be careful. Eric Abetz is a valued colleague and a sincerely motivated person on this. I don't think he is at all racist. I think if he had his time again, he probably would have chosen his words a bit differently in that hearing. I think it was unfortunate, because it doesn't reflect his genuine concern for the welfare of the Chinese diaspora as well.
Before you go, I have to ask you about Christopher Pyne's comments to the University of Adelaide. He received an honorary doctorate. He warns of war between the US, its allies, including us, and China within the next decade or so. Is that sort of language, is it realistic? Is it helpful?
I think we should be sober and realistic about these possibilities. They are, of course, possibilities. It's not something that we want to entertain or encourage in any way. In fact, I think it's really important that we have a sufficient deterrent effect to dissuade that kind of thing from happening. And in the case of Taiwan, central at that must be the self-determination of the Taiwanese people, 24 million people who participate in a free and open liberal democracy. Their say about their future has to be at the centre of what we do here.
But you're not worried about that sort of rhetoric? He says, Mr. Pyne, the former Defence Minister, said it's not just rhetoric, that this is a realistic outlook. Is it better to sort of consider that in private as opposed to be discussing it publicly?
One thing we should be wary about is that sometimes the Chinese Communist Party uses the threat of war with Taiwan to try and get preemptive concessions from the West, from the United States in particular, about the status of Taiwan. And we shouldn't allow them to use that prospect to intimidate us into doing things that we wouldn't otherwise do. In fact, it might counterproductively contribute to sending them a signal that we don't care about this issue and that it's up to them to resolve it how they like. In fact, we do deeply care about it.
Senator Paterson, appreciate it. As always, thanks.
Thanks, Kieran.